Okay, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Masculinity Unmasked, the fortnightly conversation that delves deep into what it means to be a man in the 21st century. So, the topic of today is a really important and topical one: breaking the mold, women's perspectives on supporting boys and men. As always, I'm joined by my co host and fellow coach, Greg Styan. Hi, Greg.
Hi guys, how's it going?
Good, thanks. And today, for the first time, we're very lucky to have with us two guest speakers. So we've got Anabel Reddaway, who is a positive psychology coach who works with individuals and those in relationships to help them navigate significant life events. And Linda Tilson, who is a behavioral change strategist who helps individuals to have more fulfilling relationships with their loved ones. So, Anabel, Linda, thanks very much for joining us both this evening. And I should say at the outset that both of you are expertise in your own fields, but what you're bringing to the table today as well is your own personal experiences of supporting the men and boys in your life. So, it's going to be a really interesting conversation, no doubt. So, I'm going to start with you, Anabel, if that's okay. It's great to have you on the show. And I would love if you could just share a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. Hey, Max. Hey, Greg. Hey, Linda. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me onto the show. I think you covered it basically. So I'm an EMCC accredited positive psychology coach, and I work with individuals and those in relationships that are really asking themselves the question, like, who are we now? You know, they've navigated some significant life event, and maybe they've gone through a health scare, or they've survived something quite dramatic, and they're actually faced with this idea of, I don't know who I am anymore. So it's really about identity and meaning and purpose, and how people can move forwards with lots of things that are going on in their lives.
Thanks very much for that, Anabel. Great to have you on the show. And Linda, also really great to have you on the show. Would you like to share a little bit about yourself and the work that you do as well?
Absolutely. So I am a men's wellness advocate from a female perspective, and I am the creator and host of the Men's Room Show. And I started that work because I have two sons. So they're both coming of age. So one is 15 and one's soon to be 20. And really, I'm going to be coming at today's show from a lived experience and how I choose as a mother and a wife to lean into the roles of what it means to be healthy, and that's through expression. And so that's enough about me, and then we're going to go ahead and jump back over, so I'll toss it back to you guys.
Yeah. Thanks very much for the introduction there, Linda. The whole chat today is around these scripts that boys are given growing up, right? And we were chatting a little bit before we came on the show about some of this stuff. And one of the key things, one of the key sort of readings that I've done in relation to this is the sort of man box, this idea that boys are given when they're younger, this fine set of rules that they're expected to adhere to, right? Don't show emotion, be dominant, be in control, don't show weakness, those sorts of things. Comes from Kibble's book, Act Like a Man box. And there's so much that we could talk about there. But what I'm interested in is sort of your experience through that sort of feminine lens of growing up with masculinity. What were the scripts that you both learnt around masculinity growing up? So I don't know if you want to start, Linda, and then Anabel, you take over.
Sure. So really the scripts that I grew up with were probably more of that traditional of being stoic, holding things together. But I will say in my own family dynamic, there was a time when my father needed to take care of himself, and that meant leaving a job. And so all of a sudden, my mother had to become the strong one. And so the script really got reversed. And so, I look at both dynamics, and there's pros and cons to both the dynamics of whether or not you want to cling and hold on to traditional versus moving forward to what we would call the more balanced, healthy one. And so in my life, I've been exposed to both scripts. And so for me as a mother, I want to, recognize and celebrate some of the traditional areas, but then also look about how things could be different, more healthy moving forward. And really for me, what that looks like is the being able to be expressive. That's like the number one thing, along with how do you have healthy communication with yourself and everyone that you're around.
Yeah. I think for me, I come from a slightly different lens. I mean, I I forgot to mention that I am a wife and I am a mother of a little boy. And so I have that lived experience there as well. But I think for me, growing up was a little bit different. So my dad left the home when I was 8. And you know, that wasn't the best sort of environment anyway. So I had a few different men in my life growing up. So I don't think my lens of masculinity actually came from a father figure. It's something that I learned through, say, long-term relationships, or through, you know, studying psychology and coming at it from that lens. So it was more like an academic / relational way of coming to understand masculinity through the evolution of the relationships that I had growing up with romantic partners, for example, and then being a parent to a little boy. But the main one I think that came through to me from society was this whole one of, you know, be strong, be tough, stand up. You know, if you see little boys falling over, and then it's like, oh, come on, stand up, you know, you're fine. And it's encouraging that suppression of emotion. So I think that one was the one that was taught to me, and that was definitely witnessed by myself through my romantic partners, seeing them with that sort of stoic lens around emotion.
Wow. There's some really good points there. Actually, it's really interesting that I'm sat here with someone from the US and someone from the UK, and that's what got me thinking about something. Was when we're talking about lenses and masculinity, is we are all a product of our environment. And most of it in terms of men is built off role models. And I feel that what we've got in the UK at the moment is some not so good ones. The likes of Andrew Tate, you know, in America, you've got Andy Elliott, guys like that, for example, this toxic masculinity, something we're trying to work away from, you know. So it's interesting, Max, you're there talking about the man box. For me, that would be the biggest one of, you know, growing up, big boys don't cry, you know, emotional suppression. But in terms of Anabel and Linda, this is a question based at you. And you, Max, what's the worst one? You know, is it that these characters, these role models are creating this toxic masculinity, or are there any worse ones, or any ones that we should really be concerned about, you know, like big boys don't cry?
I had a real visceral response, so I don't know if you're happy for me to just jump in there. I think the one for me is around sexual dominance with men, just purely because of how often and how frequent we are seeing, you know, the rise, like, and it happens across the board, I know, but, you know, sexual violence towards women, when we're raising boys to be sexually dominant and then not having the sexual education around to support a healthier view of sexuality. And we've got younger boys accessing hardcore pornography online, things like that. So that's the one that really just got me there. I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, it's definitely around that performance, that dominance, that men are the sexual aggressors. You know, that's the sort of thing coming across there that we are still sort of reinforcing through mainstream media, pornography, things like that. Really, that's the one that just hit me, and I was like, oh, that one, yeah, that's going to come up.
Yeah, like that. The documentary on Netflix, Adolescence, you know, wasn't a documentary, but what an amazing series. And I feel that like pictures that perfectly, doesn't it? Pornography at a young age, poor role models, creating this toxic masculinity. Max, I knew you were desperate to ask a question there.
I think, Linda, do you want to share your script, and then I'll go with the one that you think's the most sort of at the top there for you in terms of the damage?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that. The one that Anabel expressed is definitely there, but the one that came to mind to me was the whole having to hold everything together, like going through life and not getting to do what you want to do because you have responsibilities to family, you have responsibilities to put food on the table, you have the responsibility to keep everything intact. When that happens, a lot of times I've seen resentment grow, shutting down of self, checking out, and I witnessed the other day a really hard one. I wanted out of the situation, but I was in a public place and there was this husband and wife, and the wife was just really being unsupportive and demeaning to him in the middle of a public place. And I'm sitting here listening to this, and he quietly tried to stay calm, be in the conversation, stay with the conversation. And eventually he just checked out, and you could just see the blank face, the I'm done, I'm checked out. And I thought, that there was another thing that can happen, is the breakdown in communication, so that the relationship is this one that's so strained that you can't even have a a conversation that's healthy and can like get to a place of connectedness. They were so disconnected. I just wanted out of the line completely. So those are just two different areas that come to me right now.
Yeah. And both of you just sharing your own personal experiences there of those things, you talked about the visceral reaction for you, Anabel, and you observed that, Linda, that came to your attention as an observation, just shows how powerful some of these things are. For me, it's the sort of, and it's tied into some of what you were saying, Anabel, it's the degradation of the feminine from a very, very early age, like, the get up, but it's also that, if you don't conform, you're a sissy, or, they use the P word, right? If you don't conform, you're the degradation of the feminine. And being feminine is the worst because women are inferior. And it's no surprise, therefore, that in the society that we live in, we have homophobia. It's no surprise that we have transphobia, particularly against trans women, because we're stepping outside of that man box, and we are effectively stepping into, or one lens to look into that is that we're coming away from that sort of toxic alpha masculinity model and moving towards a more feminine or effeminate persona, and that's a threat to toxic masculinity. That's a threat to the man box, right? So when the man box is about the degradation of the feminine, and that's the collective keeping people together, anyone who doesn't conform to that is cast aside. And I know that really impacted me growing up, being a gay man and being around that, because I didn't have any role models to say that any of this was happening. But that's the messaging. Just looking at it through that lens, but also, even if you're not part of the LGBT community, growing up as a straight guy and being told about the degradation of the feminine, it means you can't cry. It means that there's the emotional suppression, because those traits are, again, associated, even though they're not gendered, they are made gendered. They're associated with the feminine. So there's a degradation around those things because they're too feminine. So there's, from a very early age, it's the degradation of the feminine. And you're talking about adolescence, Greg, and I think it ties into that, right? It's almost like entitlement to sex, this resentment towards women, that incel ideology that's talked about in the program, and it's scary, right? The age of these kids and the thinking there. But I guess having you both on, Anabel and Linda, a really interesting question in relation to this is how women and wider society enforce these toxic narratives. Because we talked about role modeling of masculinity from that male perspective, but how can women and wider society enforce those toxic narratives? What's your experience of that?
Do you want to go first, Linda?
So you said the question was, how do we continue to enforce those toxic narratives? Because I think that the example I gave is one of them. And then the other two is, for boys that are coming of age, when they express their emotions, and you would say something that would shut that down. That to me will definitely enforce that. And if anything, I'm like the opposite. That space for my boys to express what they're feeling. They've gone through disappointments. They've gone through heartbreak. They've gone through just, feeling into who they are as a young man, and the things that they choose to feel. And I just remember that there could have been some times where it could have went the other direction, if a person wasn't aware of the messaging they use. And one of the best examples of creating that healthy masculinity is to show up and demonstrate actively what healthy looks like in our own relationships, because kids are watching. They pay attention to how their parents show up.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I was going down the same sort of lines there, Linda, in that I think, and I know going back, I've done a lot of my own work over time. And I think one of my own personal experiences, I think having a lack of male role model in my life growing up, you do sort of lean on society for those scripts to learn things. And I certainly know in, previous romantic relationships, I have been very guilty of being uncomfortable with male emotion. Like, I'll honestly put that out there. Like, it's quite hard to see men cry. Like, and I think that's something over the last 5 or 6 years that for me has been a real development on my own learning of like, this is okay. I think because I had sort of, if you want, hyper masculine alpha partners, becoming a mother and having to relearn all of that. I know when my son was a toddler, I was still sort of going, oh, up you get, when he'd fallen over. And then I sort of, as time came on and I was starting to question, and I was like, no, it's okay for him to cry if he's fallen over. Like, you've hurt yourself. it hurts, pain hurts, you're allowed to cry. So I think for me, it was a real personal journey of my own growing to know, to unlearn those scripts that had been taught to me as a woman, as a partner, as a mother. I think, yeah, that's a share that came to me then.
What came to me was like the opposite. I remember a time we were on a family trip and my boys were in the back of the truck, and my oldest was watching a movie. He was watching Forrest Gump, and all of a sudden, he's got tears coming down his eyes. His voice is softened, and he says, "That's so sad." He was talking about the scene where he lost the love of his life and he was at the cemetery. And you know what? A person could have said, "Hey, what are you crying about that for? It's just a movie or whatever." And I let him have that moment. And I thought that was important because we're going to, you're going to go through life as a man, as a person, and tough things are going to happen. And why would I want to shut that down? If anything, I want that to be the normal, to feel and not worry about who's watching, who's looking, who's going to say something. And so I'm always advocating for expression of feeling because all feelings are valid.
Yeah, I think that's definitely that's the place that I've come to through my own personal growth of having that. And I think my son taught me a lot. My son is incredibly emotionally intelligent, and he has been from a very young age. And he was always sort of brought up in school that, how kind and caring he was towards his friends. And I think he taught me a lot. And I think that's, very humbling when you've got a 5-year-old teaching you about how to handle male emotion.
Interesting. Guys, I've got a real interesting question for you. And Max, I'd love to know your thoughts on this. I feel that men in the UK, and I've lived in the US as well, but particularly in the UK, are facing a bit of a silent struggle. And the world is changing every day, gender, all sorts of stuff. But one thing I picked up on, particularly both of you talking about young boys in school, is this changing? Has the scope of this man up, toughen up, big boys don't cry? Is there a change in society? Is it positive? Because all we seem to see is the bad things. Okay, but actually, is it improving, or is it just fake, false media that's putting this in our face all the time? But is there actually an improvement in society? Max, I know you've got a lot to say on this. I'd love to know, because for me, I feel that the media loves to portray that the world is burning down. And actually, is it? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? I actually don't know. I would love to know what your thought is, particularly Linda on the other side of the pond as well, because there are lots of positives, lots of things are changing in school. Kids are a lot more emotionally intelligent. When I was a school teacher, there was a massive difference in the 5 years I was a school teacher from the start to the end, with what was acceptable and what wasn't. I'd love to know. Is there a change? Linda, what's your thoughts in the US on this? And Max, I know you're very opinionated on this. Is there a positive change? Is it getting worse?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really great question. And I think, I can only answer from my experience and from what I know, but I think there's certainly a lot more men's groups popping up, and there's certainly a big movement from what I've seen, especially here in the UK, in relation to men really craving a space where they can connect and just be their authentic selves and support other men. It's almost like a guerrilla movement at the moment. There's like popping up left, right, and centre, but it's not like a united front. So I think on that sort of macro level, it's happening, but statistics still say, men are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than women. Nearly half men still have no close friends to confide in. It's still a systemic problem, but I think more men, probably with the advent of the internet, with COVID, everyone going back behind their closed doors and thinking, actually, how do I want my life to change? Do I really want to be driving forwards at all costs and operating from this space where I'm having to hold everything in? I think it woke some people up. I think people have more awakened to this idea of wanting more, wanting to be a collective of growth rather than just going down the pub and, chatting about sport and football and nothing else. There's nothing wrong with sport and football. Sport and football's great, right? It's connection and collaborative. But if there's no space to talk about what's going on, right, as well, the challenges, and then that's just suppressed. I think that there are more spaces that are popping up. I think there's a lot more work to be done, especially at the educational level. Keir Starmer, love him or hate him, in the UK, is mandating or talked about bringing in the adolescence program into schools, which could be a good idea, right, to show children these sort of topics at a young age. We now have LGBT organizations in schools. So we're talking about degradation of the feminine. It's harder to cast people out as outsiders. There's still a lot of work there to be done. So I think there's ways from the grassroots levels that things are getting better, but I think there's still a huge amount of work to be done looking at the stats and where we're at with that from what I know from my experience. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear, your work with the men's room show. Linda, whether you have a different view there.
Well, I definitely agree that there's more awareness and there's a lot more groups for men that are popping up with different calls to action, encouraging, therapy and as a good thing to do that's helpful, but it's not enough because, and the reason why I say this is because, you get to the point where men are midlife, there's a lot of wiring that's programmed that has to be unlearned. And so really the key to raising and growing men to be healthy and to be supportive individuals in society, it's got to start with the young boys, and not every boy is going to join a sports team because he may not be into sports. Or you could make groups in the academic arena for the young boys that are more logically based and intuitive and want to go down that path. So it's like, how do you make a group for young boys that they all want to join and be a part of, that it's the cool in thing to do? Because like many things, you make it fun and exciting, you want to join. And so that puts more pressure, because I have friends that are teachers, more pressure on the social emotional learning dynamic, because not only are they teaching the academics, they are been asked to help with the social piece of it. And there's only so many people to go around in the teaching community. So it's like, it needs to be a program that's integrated into the schools where it starts early. If you start early and you can change those scripts, those dynamics, those narratives, you're going to have a whole different society of men coming through the systems and into society. And so, as a role, what I'm doing each and every day, if I hear something that doesn't sound quite right, or I think might be on the toxic end, I'll start to ask questions of curiosity around why my sons are feeling this way. Why are they thinking this way? And see where that maybe they could shift their own narrative, because, they may not be able to shift all of their buddies, but they could shift where they come in and, and then, be that part of the movement that shows, what healthy looks like. I mean, you can do that at 5, you can do that at 55. The choice is going to be yours. And so I believe that, yes, it should be in the school system, how to communicate and have healthy relationships. And then also, there's that whole be the advocate, be the self-advocate, lead by example. And so there's lots of areas that I think, for me, what needs to happen is to start the whole dynamic much earlier and have the help of the schools, the parents, and society as a whole. How you go about that, I'd love to lead that, but that will take a lot of people coming together as a collective to make that happen. And so more to come on that. Definitely a reason why I run and keep going the men's room show, because for the very reason I might want to end the show, it's for the reason I need to have the show. It's because of the awareness and advocacy that we get to do in the areas that are not the pretty parts. They're the messy sides. And so more work to do in that.
That's a huge part, right? And actually, the stats show, I think it's like boys aged 8 to 12 have equal emotional literacy to girls, but then after about sort of age 15, there's a sharp decline, and that's obviously related to the system. Did you have any thoughts in relation to that, Anabel, or just generally, like, even just from the female perspective? Yeah, what
No, it was interesting listening, because I was like, really not sure how I can add to this. But I think, Max, what you just said and highlighted was really quite interesting, because I did spend 2 years working with children and young people that had been at risk of or had been permanently excluded from school. And a lot of these young boys were raised in highly toxic masculine families. But I think from my own personal experience with my son is that they seem to have more availability of support in primary schools. So following the separation of myself and my son's father, the school actually, it was a male member of staff picked up on my son having, and they used the word emotional resilience problems, which I found a little bit triggering. But basically, they said that he wasn't very emotionally resilient and he was struggling with different areas. But as a result of that, he was able to access play therapy through school. So he had access to these different resources, it worked wonders for him and, later on. But I think that sort of resource and money and funding as you come into secondary school really declines. And I know we've had 2 young people at a local school commit suicide, both boys in year 11. And there's something in that that is really quite powerful, that these boys don't have a space, whether that, and I know it's systemic, I know it's across the board that, you know, boys aren't really having these spaces to be able to talk, whether they've got difficult family dynamics. But the educational system, I think as well, there's this element around performance. That was the other piece that came to me, is like, while we're still encouraging a system in education where it's very performative rather than relational, we are, and that affects boys and girls. But I know I've seen it just with my son doing his SATs recently in year 6, just how much that, you know, I have to be perfect, I have to 100%, I have to do this, rather than actually a focus on building relationships that are going to be sustainable in life and help you emotionally. It's all about, I have to get 100%, I can't get 99%. And that's coming from an educational system that I personally feel is fundamentally flawed and quite exclusionary to a lot of people. And that's where you get this inclusion, exclusion, and lots of other things around social emotional health. And this is why you have a lot more, from my experience of working with children and young people that had been excluded from school, there's a much higher rate of boys being excluded from schools. And I'm curious as to why that is happening. I don't know yet, but I'm keen to look at that in the future.
Wow, what an
For
amazing subject. Okay, I've got another deep question for you, Anabel. Angie, Linda, particularly, you've got boys, and Max, I'd love to know your input on this. Talked a lot about education, talked a lot about flawed systems. Makes me think of like classical conditioning, you know, what was all right maybe in the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s isn't okay now, you know. Disney probably being the best example of that. If you actually watch a new Disney now, lots of them come with warnings at the start of what was acceptable when it was made isn't acceptable now. I remember seeing one for the Siamese cats in, is it Dumbo or one of them like that, which is amazing. And that goes to show how far things have changed, yeah? I've got a question for you. Have we gone too far with some of this? That's one question. Second question, what would you reinforce? What do we need more of? You know, is that, we talked about a failing of a system. We talked about, you know, the difference between classical and operant conditioning, punishing them if they don't get results, for example. What do we need to reinforce? What do we need to develop? What do we need to get better at? Is putting cautions on Disney the right way forward? What's your thoughts on that, Max, as well?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? I certainly don't think that we've got, if we talk about too far in the sense of you know, moving towards a healthier form of masculinity, I don't think we've gone that way in terms of the pendulum. In terms of the redress, how do we redress the balance? I think that's a really interesting question, ties into what Linda and Anabel were saying. I mean, within all of us, right, we all have two energies, right? We have this active energy, this doing energy, and we have this softer, intuitive energy. And if you look at anything in nature, like a tree, it has structure, it has bark, and it also has leaves, right? And so the structure holds it together and it grows up, but it can't do anything without the leaves, that receptive part. But then the leaves are useless if it doesn't have the structure. And we as human beings are the same. But we live in a society that's grounded on the wounded masculine, which is this drive forward at all costs, action, 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 linking into Anabel's point, perfectionism, 100% tests, driven performance, all of that. But other than that, relational, nurturing, intuitive side, that's all lost in the mix. And people talk about like masculine, feminine energy, you may hear it like yin, yang, but we're talking about those two energies, that active, that passive. And what gets lost in the mix is that passive energy. And, you know, not just for men, but also for women. And I think that's what needs to change. Early on at school, we need to be introducing this more relational, nurturing, intuitive energy, connection to that energy, rather than this just doing, achieving energy action, because it serves no one. And then we're all left in a space where we're all driving forwards at all costs until we can't anymore. And then when we can't anymore, we don't have the facilities and the tools to do anything about it, because none of us are, you know, intuitive. None of us are that nurturing to ourselves. You know, if you speak to most people, they have that inner critic voice. They're not very self-compassionate. So that softer side is often cast aside. It's degraded. And I think that's what needs to come and be brought back in to a large extent to address that balance. But I'll be interested in hearing everyone else's thoughts.
I would say that I agree that recognition of that softer side rather than the doing performance needs to be brought back in. I personally experienced in the workforce, you know, more focus being on the performance than the relationship part. And I would be in struggle because with that line of thinking, because I thought, well, if you can create the open, curious communication in relationships, well, then the performance is going to 10x anything that you do. Anything in absence of that, you're just going to be grinding until you get it. You aren't going to be reaching out a hand to help your colleague when they need you most. And so I'm always going to focus in on that. And I'd love to see a society actually recognize some of the soft skills and not just reward all of the technical hard skills.
I think all of that for me is true. So the first thing that came to my mind was relationships and communication and psychological safety. So it's providing those really safe environments for boys and men to feel that they can be vulnerable and not be judged for that. Because I think sometimes as women, we can do that because we don't always know any better because we're lacking the education around how to work with male emotion. But I think it's, for me, it's like a yes and. So it's not dismissing masculinity. It's embracing strength and vulnerability. It's having performance and humanity. It's fostering connection and responsibility without shame. So it's having it's relationships, it's communication, and it's psychological safety, it's partner responsiveness. As women, wives, parents, we have a responsibility to provide those environments where our sons and our husbands and fathers, if you like, those spaces that they can be completely vulnerable without shame. I think that's really important. Brené Brown does some amazing work on male vulnerability. Highly recommend anyone to go and check that out. She's brilliant when she's talking about vulnerability and shame in men. She did all her research on vulnerability in women, and then someone said, well, what about the men? And so she went off on a huge thing and did it with men, and it's absolutely incredible. And it's just having that yes and. You can still have this masculine, just bring in a bit more of the warmth, the care, the kindness, the compassion for yourself as well, and balancing it all together. It's not giving up one to take on another. It's both together.
Yeah. Such a great point. And it's that healthy masculinity, right? It's that discernment, that accomplishing, but that awareness, rather than that forced driving forwards at all costs. I think that's that balancing that we come back to. I think there's so much in that what you just said and the shame part. We could talk about this for hours, all of us. This is already a great conversation. We are unfortunately coming to time, and what Greg and I usually do is ask for key takeaways. What I'm thinking might be interesting is, from your perspective, what would you share with women listening to this conversation, and what would you share with men, focusing specifically on the sort of script stuff from all three of you?
Okay, so for me, it's saying to men that all of your emotions are valid and important and need to be recognized and supported. And then for women, it's allowing the space, the protected space for the men and boys in your life to be able to share and be vulnerable without the fear of judgment or shame.
And the takeaway that I would want to leave our audience with is that I would like for men and women to stop taking sides and saying whose fault it is, and own responsibility for what you can as a man or a woman bring to help or hinder the conversation. That's what I believe.
Great stuff. Yeah. I actually think that what we tend to see in the news and what we see daily is all negative. But actually, I do feel that there's a lot of positives. And I do feel that we are in the middle of a movement. So my advice would be to be yourself. Don't think you've got to be manufactured or be something that you see on Instagram or X or LinkedIn. It's okay to be comfortable in your own skin. So my best advice would be, maybe even for a parent as an ex-teacher, is to pick your role models wisely. Be careful where you look. But I don't think it's all just negative. I feel like we're all so easy to blame, but actually there are a lot of positives going on in the world, and you can see that, there are lots of things to look forward to.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Great. Well, thanks, Anabel, Linda, and Greg, for delving into the topic. It's been great to hear everyone's thoughts, and thanks to everyone for listening. Hopefully you found this conversation interesting. It's certainly been really interesting from where I've been sitting. Linda, if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, so there's two great ways. One could be on LinkedIn, and then the other is on the mensroomshow.com, which also has a link to our Men's Room Show and channel.
Great. Thank you. And Anabel, same question.
Yes, I think it's the same. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Anabel Reddaway. And you can also find me through my website, which is coequalcoaching.com.
Thanks very much, both, and for your time this evening. If you resonate with this topic or anything that you shared today, or have any questions or insights about it, please do get in touch. We always love hearing from you. And our next conversation is with guest speaker Louise Lewis, which will be No More Hiding: How to Live Life Your Way. And that will be our final conversation for this evening. Thank you very much for this evening, for this season. Thanks very much, everybody, and take care.